Grace and peace to you. I'm Todd Townsend, Bishop of Huron. Years ago after worship one Sunday morning, I was asked an alarming question. What is grace anyway? It's a great question. I would call it the question of our lives. It's also a terrible question because I'm tempted to try to answer it. After all, I've studied it. It was the only real question in the background of my doctoral studies. I wrote a whole chapter in the book about it. I've made preaching grace the only real requirement of courses that I teach, suggesting that at the end of every sermon that we preach, there can be an opportunity to experience grace. I'm not boasting because I do not succeed in these things myself, not fully. The question, what is grace, is almost like asking, what is love? You know it when you experience it, and you can know it many, many different ways. You can know it again for the first time 1,000 times. You have to see it happening to name it. You say, that right there. Did you see that? Did you feel that? That's love. Or that's grace. In many ways, we can only point to grace when we see it happening and say, that right there, and use metaphors for it. We say, isn't that what we mean by grace? Isn't that God working right there? That must be grace. Grace is not something that can be handled or bottled and kept or produced. It is not valuable in the same way that other things are valuable. It's not useful as other things are useful. It's not a thing. But it is the central reality of the Christian life with God. And it has a constellation of concepts around it. And some of these ideas that relate to grace help make it more thinkable, making these amazing occurrences of life with Jesus thinkable and enjoyable. So I'd like to give you just a few basic concepts and a story, two stories really, but let's start here. What is the reason that grace is needed? Human nature. What makes grace so powerful? Sin and its ability to confront and overcome it. About 16 years ago, there was a big debate, a dust-up between two people, Augustine and Pelagius. And the outcome of this has shaped our thinking about grace ever since. On the one side, you have Pelagius. The way he thought is the way that most people in our society right now think all of the time. Pelagius was not a bad person, probably, but the church considers him a heretic. Now, don't think of the Inquisition and burning people at the stake and all that. This is way before that. A heretic 1,600 years ago was simply someone who was teaching something about the faith that was not good enough for the gospel. It didn't describe the reality well enough. A heretic tends to make things too small. Pelagius believed that human beings were inherently good and good enough that we can, with great effort, become perfect. We can make ourselves and the things around us good. And because we can become good, it is our obligation to do so, he would say. On the other side, Augustine said, no, we are created good, but we are weakened by sin, by life, by the world, and making ourselves right before God, or making ourselves perfect before God, is an impossible task. And only God is truly good, so God would not expect us to do something that is impossible for us. God, says Augustine, is tender and kind. It is in God's nature to always have mercy. It's what God is like. And God knows that we are not strong enough to do everything on our own. Besides that, he says, if we think like this, why do we even need God? We'd only need God because we need someone to reward us for making ourselves good and perfect. So God's job then would be to demand perfection and then wait around for us to achieve it? Then to let those perfect ones into heaven and send all the other ones to burn? No, says Augustine. That is not the God we've come to know in Jesus. Now, both of these guys could quote Scripture to make their points really well. Even the devil quotes Scripture to make points. So, who's right? Pelagius? That humans are to self-improve all of their lives, and those who succeed will be given rewards, and those who are weak and fail will not. Or Augustine? We will succeed sometimes, we will be faithful sometimes, but we'll also be weakened enough by sin, the world, and the devil to fail. Augustine's version was deemed to be more faithful because it resounded with the actual experience of most Christians with God. We struggle, we fail, our own efforts are not sufficient. And yet, God sends God's self. It is a self-gift, and it is grace. God happens, and we call it grace when it's recognized. We're upheld, we're healed, we're given newness and life, and it is a gift. No one earns it. No one deserves it. Contrary to most of the advertising that you see today, most good things are not deserved, they're a gift. Most good things in life are a gift that you could not have given to yourself. And if you know what I mean by that, you know a bit about grace. Grace comes in many forms, but it's really just a word for what happens in God's gift of self. The gift is God's presence, God's healing touch, God's creative power. It shows up liberating and healing. It shows us and works on us, or works through us for someone else's sake. It's prevenient grace. It always goes before us. God always acts first. It's operative grace. It makes things happen. It's cooperative grace because we're invited into it to participate in these actions of God. And always it makes us more gracious, at least for a while. And sometimes it transforms us from the inside out. Fred Craddock is a great preacher and a person who knew grace, professor of preaching, and he tells of being in an unfamiliar city after giving some lectures one time, and he was there overnight on a Saturday, so he was looking for a place to go to church on Sunday where he could worship. So he asked at the hotel desk, and they said a few blocks down the road he could walk to it. Well, when he got there, he was welcomed warmly. He found that by the time the liturgy was to begin, the church was full. It was a small, modestly built church, but very pleasant and warm. And by the time the service started and the procession began, he saw what he would expect. The choir came in and followed by the minister, but he saw the minister was a very tall man, very large person. The most noticeable thing was his stumbling, lumbering gait. He was awkward, almost falling when he walked. His head was a bit misshapen, like there'd been an injury. He stumbled up the 3 or 4 stairs to get into his place to begin officiating the service. He realized then that his vision was so poor that when he read, he held the book right up to his nose, and speaking seemed to come with great struggle. But as soon as he started to speak, Craddock lost all sense of what he had noticed before. And while he wasn't a great preacher, it was so warm and so full of love and affection, with the conviction that what he was preaching he had experienced deeply in his own life. And for all of his lack of outwardly attractiveness, what was inside was just beautiful, and you could witness something shining out from his spirit. So Craddock waited after the service. He wanted to talk to him. And while he was waiting, he listened to people as they left the sanctuary. And again, there was such love and affection between them. And at one point, he heard a woman, when she was done speaking with him, say, "I wish I could have known your mother." And he responded, "My mother's name was Grace." When it was just the two of them, after everyone left, Craddock said to him, "It was wonderful to see you interact with the people, and it was an interesting response you gave that woman. My mother's name is Grace." And the preacher explained why that was just the best answer he could give to her comment. "When I was born," he said, "I was put up for adoption and nobody wanted to adopt me. So I went from foster home to foster home. And when I was 16 or 17, I saw some young people going into a church. And I wanted to be with young people, so I went in too. And there in that church, I met grace, the grace of God. And that's when my life really began. There I met the grace of God. May your life be a place like that. May our churches continue to be places like that, places of grace where we can know God and travel from ashes to hope.